What is up, everybody? Welcome back to another edition of the Sheehan Show with me, Sean Sheehan, on Sherdog.com. But today I'm joined by a great man, Harry Powell, for a little bit of a different podcast. And we'll break the fourth wall here a little bit because we're recording this about a week early, a little bit more. I mean, Harry, I actually asked Harry a week ago, would he come on and do this podcast with me? Because it's kind of I think it's a thing we've been kind of talking about recently, and we're like, oh yeah, we need to do this podcast. And then or maybe that was just in my own mind, but that's how I like to hear it going anyway. And it is a preview for the upcoming UFC. Is it 294, I believe, or 293? I'm not sure, whatever it is. Fight between Islam Makhachev and now Alexander Volkanovski. And it initially was obviously Islam Makhachev versus Charles Oliveira, and what we were going to do is, obviously the lads are doing the breakdown of it and all, and we're not stepping on those toes. They're doing the whole breakdown, the whole card. But what we're doing here is a look at rematches, and with that fight maybe at the far end of the rematches. Now, it was supposed to be one rematch. It is a different rematch, and it actually changes the conversation that I was thinking about having, I think, because it's added in another layer for me. And we will get into all of that. But Harry, thank you very much for having me here. There's three things I want to talk about with rematches, Harry. The technical side, which I think is the most important. The mental side, which I think is massive as well. But the physical side, right? So this is the part I've kind of added in since maybe we'll start with the Volkanovski Oliveira. Maybe we'll go off of it and then maybe we'll get back to it. The physical side of rematches sometimes is something we don't really think about an awful lot. Like, a lot of these rematches, when they do happen, they happen 6 months from when the last one happened, or 3 months from when the last one happened. And there is the cuts, the bruises, the injuries. And like with Volkanovski coming into this one against Makhachev, I look up his Instagram, and 2 weeks ago he still had that heavily strapped arm. You know, he had the surgery not too long ago. And just that part of it, and maybe it's very specific for this matchup, but it is often something. Like, I was even thinking, and I'm into texting him yesterday, but like Peter Queally, when he got that injury the other week, it's like, you know, we saw the injury happening, but like, has anyone checked in on him, or has anyone, like, you know, and that's the thing you've talked about an awful lot, and I think you actually have had lads on and done that podcast with him and stuff. So from someone from that point of view, is that a part of it? Like, when we're getting into rematches, when we're analysing rematches, that we kind of just forget, that we don't delve into enough the actual physical side of the first match. And whether it's the physical side in terms of the actual injuries or everything like that, but also the physical side of what just happened in that and how it maybe affects you mentally, which we'll get to later on.
So I think, forget rematches for a second. Just in fighting, full stop, we forget that these people are humans and their bodies break just like our bodies break, right? And so when we get wrapped up into the fanfare of a fight, we get wrapped up into the marketing and the media and all of these portions of promotion that we fall in love with. Very few people, when the news broke last night, as we're recording right now, but the other day, that Alexander Volkanovski was stepping in on short notice to replace Charles Oliveira, not one person on Twitter did I see say, "Oh, sure, but didn't he just have surgery like 3 days ago?" Everything was, the set of stones on Volkanovski, fair play to Makhachev for taking a fight on short notice. Like, this is an unbelievable rematch. Can't believe we're getting to see it right now. A couple of people saying they'd preferred Gamrot because that was going to be his position. Some people lamenting poor Charles Oliveira for such an horrendous cut so close to the fight. All of these things. And so we're able to pass Charles Oliveira having an injury, and so we can think of him in a human form. But when we look at somebody like Alexander Volkanovski, who looked essentially superhuman in the first fight, it's very difficult for us then to pass that he could be walking into this injured. He could be walking into this far less than 100%. Now, there's an element with which we can and have said many, many times that fighters very rarely, I shouldn't say never, but very rarely go into fights 100%. But if we think and I'm sure we're going to pull this specific example, but when we look at Brandon Moreno and Davison Figueiredo, who had 700 fights in the space of about 3 weeks, very rarely did we talk about, until I think it was the third or maybe even the fourth, I can't quite remember, but we didn't talk about, well, what about a weight cut like? What about the damage taken from camp? What about when you look at them and they fought for 50 minutes and you have 50 minutes of tape of them together, you say, shit, these lads aren't that far apart. Like, they're really not that far apart. How do we split them? Well, we split them based on potentially some of the physical attributes that they come into the fight with. One fighter had a really, really good weight cut. The other one didn't. One had a bit of a banged up knee in camp. The other one didn't. One of them took a bit of a concussion in camp. The other one didn't. All of these things parlay into performances on Fight Night, whether that's rematches or otherwise.
And another part of that is obviously the notice in which you get the fight as well. Like for Volkanovski, it's going to be a physical issue. For Makhachev, it's going to be more a technical issue, obviously preparing for one person, and now he's going to have to prepare for someone who is literally like the complete opposite almost of that fighter. And we will probably jump back to that part of it when we talk more about the specific matchup towards the end of this. But I do want to talk about the tactical part, because that's the meat and bones of this. And what I did something unusual, because we just kind of half discussed this, and we were like, we're going to maybe pull out a few examples and discuss the art of the rematch rather than this specific rematch itself. And do you know what I did? And I've never done this before, but I went back and I listened to some of my podcasts after the rematches. So I listened to the last Max Holloway Volkanovski rematch, the morning after. I listened to that podcast, and Leon Edwards versus Usman as well. And what I got from those was that it was a technical issue that won the fight. It came down to technique, not technique, a tactical issue, not a technical issue, a tactical issue that won, and well, maybe a technical issue, especially, well, in both of those cases, absolutely technical issue, but also when I was looking at the Oliveira Makhachev one, it was definitely a technical issue, but I do think it is more tactical based on the technique in rematches more so than anything else, because you've seen the person, you felt it, you know the way they fight somewhat. Now, there are adjustments on both sides at times, but I am just fascinated by those tactical adjustments, right? And I think we will get into the mental side of it, but the mental side of those tactical adjustments is also fascinating, because it's a kind of a do you stick or twist type of thing, right? So I'll give you the example of, and I don't know if you agree with this or not, but the Holloway Volkanovski, the final fight. Those fights were all very different. Like, Holloway had some very good moments in some of the fights. Some people thought he won, at least one of the fights, if not two. But in the final fight, there was no doubt about it. Volkanovski obviously won it. And in my listening back to the podcast where I talked about it and remembering the fight, it was because Holloway tried to fight Volkanovski at his game. He tried to take him on where he was best at, thinking, okay, he's beaten me there before. The judges are not giving me the cards when I fight my way, so I'm going to have to fight his way and beat him there. He did that and then got absolutely destroyed because he's fighting Volkanovski in his game. You look at that and you look at, say, the Leon Edwards versus Usman fight. And I think it was a very similar fight to the first one, but that was, I think, a mental and tactical move by Usman to be maybe a little bit more careful. And in a mental thing by Edwards to actually have, he got taken down a couple of times, but he kept popping back up and popping back up and popping back up. And maybe that's a technical thing from the first fight, knowing how the takedowns are and knowing what it's like and being able to get back up because of it. But it's also probably a tactical thing that, like, okay, I'm going to let him do that, but I know once I get to this position, I'm going to have an underhook or I'm going to have an overhook or whatever it might be, and I'm going to pop back up, and I let him take me down, but I'm getting back up. A technical, tactical adjustment to win the fight. So, with that said, and this is a very, very, very open-ended question, but what, in your opinion, having watched a load of rematches over the last while, is the best thing to do? Do you make big wide-ranging adjustments? Or is it just the little things? Is it sticking to your game plan, knowing that your fundamentals are good, adjusting something small, almost in the hope that your opponent does something big, akin to Holloway did, and they kind of just play into your hands? What way do you see that? Obviously, it's a very open-ended and start to maybe a discussion there, but what's your thoughts on it?
So I think there's just one small contextual addition I'll make. I think that tactical adjustments happen at the elite level. I think that when we look at Oliveira versus Makhachev, I think that the technique imbalance is so wide that if we were to have seen Oliveira versus Makhachev, Oliveira was going to need to adjust both technically and tactically, whereas Makhachev could essentially look to rinse and repeat, right? He didn't necessarily have to worry about sticking or twisting because of how dominant the first fight was for him. With Alexander Volkanovski, Islam Makhachev has to think, well, at the end of the last fight, I was gassed. I wasn't able to scramble. I wasn't able to wrestle in the way that I have been able to wrestle in all of the other performances I've had in MMA. I was on bottom. I was losing that round, or that portion of the round, those last sort of minute and a half, minute 45 seconds. And I wasn't able to hold this man down for long, significant periods of time, right? There was the back attack, but nothing happened, right? So whatever. But for Volkanovski, and that to me is a really interesting mental perspective, because that, and there's this beautiful golden triangle happening, right? There's the physical changes that influence the tactical changes, that influence the mental changes, and vice versa. And so in this specific rematch for Islam Makhachev, he has to question, was my cardio good enough the first time? Did I try to expend too much energy in trying to hold Alexander Volkanovski down? Do I then say, okay, well, instead of trying to expend energy holding him down, I'm going to let him rise because I know he will, and I'm going to try and put him in a washing machine of just continuously taking him down a la Colby Covington, Robbie Lawler? Am I going to want to trade with him in the pocket like I did do? Am I going to be more aware of the reverse Z guard sweeps, the far lat grips to get up, the butterfly hook sweeps in order to create space, the forward shifting? Am I going to be more aware of those things? Because we have to think from Volkanovski's side, he hasn't had Craig Jones for 12 weeks in this. He hasn't had the brand new ideas and brand new information that somebody that's so intrinsically attached to pure grappling will bring into the camp. That's not to say Volkanovski doesn't have the innovations from an MMA perspective in his own camp. I'm absolutely sure he does. But there is a very, very large difference between Craig, for instance, going away, analyzing that first match, coming back and saying, right, we've got 12 weeks and this is what I saw and this is what we're going to improve on. And then whatever the fruits of those labors are, come out. The other interesting wrinkle, I think, that sort of hinders potentially Volkanovski, but also potentially rewards him, is his incremental achievements or progressions in grappling are going to be so much faster than Islam Makhachev's, who is a guy that has wrestled his entire life. There is very little that you're going to show. Let's say Khabib, I know that he's not necessarily coaching or a prominent figure as much anymore, but there's not much that Khabib or anyone else is going to show Islam Makhachev from a grappling perspective that he hasn't seen before. There's very little. And so that, to me, raises a doubt in Islam Makhachev's mind from his tactical and technical approach to the grappling. Because you had a guy that has seen all of the things and still couldn't hold him down. Fine. For Alexander Volkanovski, he is going to be seeing things. He is going to be shown things that he's either never seen before or he hasn't had significant mat time with. And so the real beauty of this fight, at least to me, is both guys are staring at each other with two loaded pistols. But nobody knows how many bullets are in there. Nobody knows what chamber they're in. And nobody knows which one's going to pull the trigger first in order to force the other to make an adjustment. And I have absolutely no idea what we are going to see. I can make a profession, right? I can say what I think Islam Makhachev should do, or I think Alexander Volkanovski should do, but I have absolutely no idea how it's going to play out.
That was one of the points I wanted to touch on too, right? And not even about this specific rematch, but like, who's going to win the rematch? is almost a question we ask. And why are they going to win the rematch? And I think there are a few prevailing wisdoms, right? One of which is, right, who do you think is going to win the rematch? Right? And that's a very easy thing to say, but like based on the first fight, based on like who's the younger up and coming guy against maybe the old champion if he's just after beating him, like who's going to win that rematch? Now this is obviously a very different example because both are prime champions right now, right? Okay, and maybe you'll say, look, Volkanovski's taking on short notice, so Makhachev will win, and if that's your prevailing wisdom, no problem. But this is a bad example for what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about the art of the rematch. But like, here's a few examples, right? Pena, Nunes, right? After that fight, you're thinking, who's going to win that rematch? The prevailing wisdom there to me was, well, Pena had a good night. Nunes had the worst night of her career. It's probably not going to be as bad again, even if she isn't the fighter she once was. She's probably going to win the rematch. She did, right? That doesn't always work out, right? So the Usman Edwards talk. Now, there was kind of two trends of talk going in there. One was that Edwards would improve and he would now maybe win more clearly. After the first fight, like he was losing and he got that big, massive knockout heard around the world. It was unlikely that would happen again. And, from one side of it was Edwards would improve and win. The other side of it was he probably won't knock him out again. Usman will do the same thing and win. And one of those things happened and the other one didn't. Edwards did improve. Usman probably wasn't exactly the same, and he went in there and won, right? So one of the prevailing wisdoms did win. Now, the prevailing wisdom isn't always obvious, and maybe to say that there's two prevailing wisdoms is a contradiction in terms, but even to say the Valentina Shevchenko one, right? And she should have won the fight only for an errant scorecard. It was like, right, Grasso's obviously better than maybe people thought, versus Shevchenko. I think everyone thought she was a good fighter, but when put up against Shevchenko, and maybe Shevchenko can kind of turn around in the next one, and she did. And for all intents and purposes, she won that fight. And I just wonder, right? So and there's other fights, right? Let's say, I don't know, who's a long reigning champion at the moment. John Jones, right? Let's say John Jones fights Jailton Almeida in 6 months. And Almeida just goes in there and he jabs the face off him. He takes him down. He destroys him on the ground, right? And they fight again. Everyone will be picking Almeida to win that, right? Because they'll say, John Jones only had 90 seconds against Gagne. He knocked out Stipe in a minute. Let's look into the future. He's only had 3 minutes at heavyweight. He's been out for fucking 5 years. Almeida's the coming guy. He's the young up and comer. The prevailing wisdom in going into that would be that Almeida will win, and it'll probably be right. It'll probably be right. So, what have you learned from rematches down through the years? Right, and it's a weird thing to say the prevailing wisdom, right? Because the prevailing wisdom could be Grasso is the new young up-and-comer, but I just said Shevchenko was the favourite to win coming in, right? Is there just the feel? Is there like the, that shouldn't happen, it's going to reverse its course? It doesn't always work that way, but in my mind, right? It usually does work that way. Like if it's a big feel one, like if it's a massive one, like a Dillashaw beating a Barrow or something like that. It's this guy's just a new level. Whereas like Pena Nunes doesn't feel like a new level. Grasso Shevchenko did feel like a close one, but also it was a finish. Kind of an unlucky one. Shevchenko was winning the fight. What's your opinion on that? What's your opinion on picking rematches? And I think what Olive just said is it's kind of still hard, isn't it? like picking all MMA fights is.
So I think it entirely depends. Is the answer, right? Like, I'd say there are a couple of categories. The first one is when you have a long reigning champion, like Shevchenko was, for instance, or like a John Jones. They're a long reigning champion for a reason. Israel Adesanya the same. They are a long reigning champion for a reason. Primarily, that reason is because they're the best in the division by a long way, and they've turned away a number of different contenders that have a number of different styles. So then we, as the colloquial we, the fan base and a portion of the media will start pulling out words like pound for pound great and divisional all-timer and all this garbage and nonsense, right? But we forget, I think, that each fight is different. If we look at Matsara GSP, lightning in a bottle the first time. What happened the second time? It was not the same thing by any stretch of the imagination. We look at Alexander Volkanovski, Max Holloway, right? First and second fights, close, very close fights. Third fight, Alexander Volkanovski came in and just decimated one of the best fighters we've seen at 145. Absolutely washed him. Fine. Shevchenko and Grasso. There are so many variables in that. Crazy scorecards, Valentina growing old in her mixed martial arts career, Valentina having injuries in the first round, Grasso finding lightning in a bottle in that fifth round of the first fight. There's just so many variables that go into each and every one. We've already talked about some of the variables in Moreno Figueiredo, but I think that the general category that I'll go with is you get like a shock upset, which is GSP Serra, for instance. You get a Israel Adesanya versus Alex Bahia, which is Alex Bahia is an elite level striker and Israel Adesanya is an elite level striker, and they came into an MMA cage and did some striking, right? And so it was not out of the realm of possibility in any stretch of the imagination going in that if they just did striking, that Alex Bahia could win that fight. And he did, right? In the preview shows leading up to it, we said if Israel Adesanya chooses to make this an MMA fight, he should win handy because he's been training in MMA for a significant amount of time. And so the skill acquisition should be vastly higher than Alex Bahia. He didn't. He chose to make it a striking battle. Fine. And he loses. The second fight, the same thing happened. And so the odds can be tipped either way. And then I think there is the other where you have two fighters that and I'll go back to Volkanovski and Max. In that first fight, the very first one, that was absolutely a 50-50 fight. And coming in again, this Makhachev versus Volkanovski, the first time we talked about this, we talked about it as if it was a 50-50 fight. And whilst I think, given the fact that Makhachev has had a full camp and Alexander Volkanovski hasn't, Volkanovski's coming off surgery and all these things, I think it's hard to say this is a 50-50 fight just because of, as you've said, the physical nature of this rematch and the variables that we have to take into account when we're talking about it. But I've said all of that to say one thing, and that's I haven't got a fucking clue how you pick rematches, really. Like, I agree with you that there is a prevailing wisdom that the first person that wins generally should win the second time, but there are so many instances where not even that's true, you know?
What I haven't thought about this during this chat. I think calmness is probably the best thing that you could have going from one fight to the next fight, right? And what I mean by that is, if it's let's say it's the Oliveira Makhachev fight, if that had happened, you used the word washed earlier. He got washed in that fight. Something massive would have to have happened, right? This fight we actually have very close fight, right? Nothing big has to happen. The Holloway fights, the Figueiredo Moreno fights, apart from the last Holloway fight, all very close fights. Well, not all very close fights, but close fights. Don't change much. Don't go too mad, right? And so the three parts, right? Physical. That's harder to control, but if you can stay physically the same, perfect. Tactically, take the Jose Mourinho approach, right? Don't go mad, don't go crazy. Let's do what we did the first time with a little few adjustments that might make things better, right? And that, you said it before, they're like a triangle. It leads in to the mental side. Because if you get the two of them down pat, you're physically good coming in, you're tactically set, and you're tactically sure. Like, you're like, okay, we're just going to do this. This is what we're going to do. Not a big deal, not a big adjustment. The best thing I can do here is be calm, believe in what I did the first time, even if I lost, do it again, do it a little bit better and win. And that mental side is huge, right? Because you see people all the time going in against people they once fought, right? Especially if they've been knocked out. And they don't, beforehand, they're like, they don't say much, but after, they're all like, I was afraid I was going to get knocked out again. I was afraid the same thing was. I'm not afraid is the wrong word, but you get what I mean. I thought it was going to happen again. I was worried about it. It was going to happen again. But you, as a fighter, you have to fool yourself. You have to believe that's not going to happen, but you have to do it with some assurance. I think Bisping was a great man at doing that, and he's a great example because, the Dan Henderson fight where he got knocked out and then he fought me and almost got knocked out and won the fight. A great example of it, and a great example of a rematch where the mental side of it is absolutely massive. Another example where the mental side of it was massive, I think, is that Usman-Edwards fight, where it went against him, I think. Now, there's physical parts of that as well. I think Usman is a shadow of himself physically. But look at the Adesanya fights. The first fight between Adesanya and Pereira, I think Adesanya lost it because of his mentality. The second fight, I think he won it because of his mentality, And that is a massive, massive, massive part. I just wonder, and from that, let's transition and we'll close it out by talking a little bit more about Makhachev and Volkanovski. I think if the two of these were to match up, right, and it was just a normal fight and they had 3 months of preparation, I actually think from all 3 points, I think they'd both be physically good. I think they'd both be tactically good and both make little bits of adjustments and we'd see who would win. But I also think the mental side, the two of these seem to be very good mentally. Especially Volkanovski, I would say. Makhachev, he hasn't really been massively tested. When he was in that Volkanovski fight, there was a little bit of a question. He still went and he won the fight and he probably won it, more decisively than even I said at the time and maybe others as well. But I think it would be that. How, though, Harry, does that short notice change the mental part? And we'll get to that first, and then we'll talk about maybe any more tactical things that we want to talk about. But the mental part of that short notice, I know we kind of started off with that, but how does that play into everything else?
No idea. We're going to have to wait and see, because it could be, right? I mean, look, put it this way. Volkanovski didn't have to take this fight, right? He could have said, sure, look, I've been booked or rumored to be booked against Topuria in Toronto at the start of next year. I'm going to heal up this elbow. I'll go and smash Topuria, and then me and Makhachev can do the thing that we said we were going to do previously. He could have said that, and the UFC would have had very little complaints. Gamrot would have been flown in, and Gamrot probably goes and fights Islam Makhachev. So that tells you something about where Alexander Volkanovski thinks he is physically, 1, mentally, 2, and 3, tactically. Because one of the points, I think, just to stress what you said about calmness, I think that fighters that are going into rematches, you have to look at the previous fight with no ego. And you have to take the lessons learned for good and for bad, and then go in and treat it as another fight as if you've sparred with the guy before. You've got a little bit of learning on him. You've got a little bit of, you certainly know how his aura feels as a human. You know what strength he feels like. Is he very strong? Is he less strong than you thought? Is he a bit more explosive than you thought? A little bit less explosive than you thought? Are the footwork patterns a little bit different than what you expected when you watched tape on him? And all of these sorts of things. But they are different fights. And I suspect coming in here, the mentality for Volkanovski is, if I lose, I lose. Like, I've taken this on 2 weeks' notice. And whilst the MMA community will, in the interim, certainly favor that decision should he lose, I think long-standing, as and when this trilogy does, because if he loses, there's definitely a third fight. Like, there's almost certainly a third fight somewhere down the line. That is not remembered fondly by the MMA media. But this, I think, says everything about, to your point, the mentality of the short notice. Alexander Volkanovski says, well, sure, look, I haven't sat on my laurels here. I have gone and I've watched that fight. I've analyzed that fight. And if and when I get that fight back, I'm going to do this, this, and this differently. Well, now's his chance. Now's his chance. And he's not got to worry about weight cutting as much as if it was a 145 short notice, which obviously wouldn't happen as he's the champion. But he can come in here and he may have a wealth of preparation mentally for what's going to happen and what he wants to achieve in this next rematch. For Islam Makhachev, the question is, like you've said, he's been prepping for Charles Oliveira the entire time, which is an entirely different matchup. So how has Islam Makhachev been splitting his mind to say, well, I'm probably going to have Charles Oliveira next, but if and when this rematch happens, what I'm going to be doing to Alexander Volkanovski is X. I would imagine The answer is probably not, like, because he beats Alexander Volkanovski and he's then saying, okay, well, Volkanovski's going to go and do another fight at 145. That fight's 9 months away. I haven't got to worry about that right now. I've got to worry about whoever it is at 155. Whereas Volkanovski strikes me as a man that can't let that go. That fight keeps him up at night, and that fight ruminates in him. And fuck, I should have gone left when I went right, or I should have really gripped that lat grip a bit. Like, all of these individual things will have fed into Volkanovski. My question is nothing to do with the mentality of Volkanovski. Maybe a portion of tactical questions. My questions are, he ran Makhachev physically so close in that first fight, and then managed to overcome Makhachev physically in the last embers of that fight. Can he do the same thing post-surgery without a training camp? No idea.
Very interesting. And I think I've heard my guys over in the Second Captain's podcast, they talk about scoreboard journalism, right? And and not just scoreboard journalism, but we scoreboard analysis. I suppose we do that an awful lot. Like, the Edwards Usman one is that, you know, the way you talk about how fights be remembered. I scored that fight a draw, right? And I'm on here talking about how Edwards was just better and he was a better fighter. And I scored 3 rounds for Usman. There was a point taken. Like, it's funny. And the other side of that as well is Volkanovski has been doing nothing probably but thinking about that fight as fireworks go off behind me. I had nothing there. Volkanovski's been probably doing nothing but thinking about that, rewatching it, analysing how could it be better next time. Whereas Makhachev is probably like, oh, I won that, closed the door, walked away from it. Now, that's probably a bit simplistic for me to say. People do go back and they do learn. But if we're really, like, what keeps you up at night, as you said, like Volkanovski, that fight is, I bet you it's kept him up at night, but it probably hasn't kept Makhachev up at night. What's the better side of that? Right? Who's the guy who's going to improve more because of that? You'd almost say the one who lost is, right? Now, that's not, maybe that's me coming from a negative point of view in terms of, like, the negativity fuels you better than the positivity, which isn't always the case, and depending on who you are. But I think that's very interesting. I'm a bit sad, Harry, that it's on short notice and that we can't discuss this normally. Like, we can't discuss this like, it's pure tactics. But last thing I want to do, I just want to throw it over to you, right? And we can end the podcast by you telling us what won the first fight and how that might change in the second fight. Now, strap in, folks. This could be a 45-minute answer here, but take it away. One man boot by Harry Powell.
I just readjusted myself in my seat, and I'm going to do it a second time. What won the first fight? I don't think we've got enough time, but what won the first fight was a number of things. It was the fluidity in which Islam Makhachev was able to move between striking realms and grappling realms. It was the fluidity that he was willing to engage with Alexander Volkanovski, sell him pocket exchanges and then not be there and land counters. It was his ability to be dogged in the wrestling approaches. It was his ability to lay traps and hold bait for Alexander Volkanovski in the range situations, because Volkanovski was so defensively aware that the takedown was coming. Now, I think that what could have happened and probably should have happened in that fight to make it more of a drastic win for Islam Makhachev was when he took his back. I think it was the third round. When he took Volkanovski's back in the third or the second, whatever it was, there should have been more. I really feel like Islam mentally drained himself in that situation because there was doubt in his actions. If he felt like he had that body triangle locked, he was on the underhook side and his head was connected to the mat and to the underside of Volkanovski's head, he should have been searching for chokes. He should have been landing shots. He should have been working far, far harder. And my read of that specific, and I know we're asking what won the fight, but my read there is that there was a mental falter in that immediate moment. Islam Makhachev knew he had to rest. He knew he couldn't keep the pace up that had happened in the first 2 rounds for another 5. And so he worked extremely hard to get to the back. And when he got to the back, he rested. And so I think that if I were to just flip this slightly and say, what do I expect coming in from an Alexander Volkanovski? And I actually echo your thoughts entirely that it's a real shame we don't get this when we've both had 6 to 8 week camps, because if they do, I think it's a far, far, far more intriguing fight. But Volkanovski can believe in the pace. He can believe, because at the end of that 5th round, of course he was tired, but he was nowhere near as spent as Makhachev. And one of the things that is currently the meta in sport grappling is, instead of just wading on into somebody's half guard or close guard or whatever and just working to pass them, the new meta is to exhaust your partner. If you've got a 10 or 15 minute match, you exhaust your partner in 9 minutes, 10 minutes, and then you absolutely slaughter them. And I think that if I'm Alexander Volkanovski, one of the things I'm trying to do with Makhachev is employ some of exactly the same things that I did in the last one. If the takedown comes, allow it. Don't fight so hard that we're spending energy on stopping the takedown. Understand that he is a better takedown artist than you are, but use the beats in between when your hips are up and when your hips hit the mat. So utilize changing of grips and changing of angles to get yourself up. And for Makhachev, I think the opposite has to happen. You have to keep Volkanovski in a cycle of constantly having to chase whether his hips are going to drop. And when they do drop, as soon as he starts to build, immediately run an angle change, a grip change, and walk towards another takedown.
It's almost like that Usman Edwards fight where, like, Usman probably got more takedowns in the second fight than he did in the first fight, but the fact that he wasn't able to keep him down was a big part of it. So if you let him take you down while getting prepared to get back up, give yourself a better, there's a Rugby World Cup that's going on at the moment. When there's a line out in the middle of the field, they both jump up and try to catch the line out. When there's a line out right on the line, the defensive team don't jump. They just wait, prepare for the other team to fall, and then push them back. That's almost what you need to do. It's a tactical, like it's giving up one immediately offensive maneuver to prepare yourself for a 5-10 seconds later. And that's a very interesting, I hadn't thought about that, but that is a very interesting thing. Like, because if you can do that, you have to make him a favourite to win the fight, right? Because I went back, as I said, and listened to some of the podcasts, and I listened to, this was before, funnily enough, before the fight was cancelled, and I listened back to my analysis after the Oliveira Makhachev fight, and I said, Makhachev was just so much better than Oliveira. I cannot see him ever beating him if they were to rematch. But I think Makhachev is beatable. And how is he beatable? He's beatable, and this was verbatim what I said, by a guy with really good takedown defense who's a better striker than him. And can Volkanovski be that? You know? He almost was that the first time out. Almost. Mm-hmm. Can he be that the second time? That is the question we need to ask ourselves coming into Saturday night, and maybe we'll find out. Harry, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you to everybody for listening. Find Harry at BJJ_Harry Powell on Twitter. Find all his stuff on ServereMMA.com and the ServereMMA YouTube as well. Check out the Severe Spotlight every Monday, analysing the best prospect from the weekend in mixed martial arts. Thank you, Harry, for joining me. Thank you to everybody for listening. My name is Sheehan for Sherdog.com, and I'll see you all next time.